We can judge and we can condemn the people that did not vote the way this government wanted them and the English government wanted them, and certainly the EU wanted them to vote. We can remain in denial and we can continue to think that the EU can continue as is without the UK, and that our role is to be good European citizens and comply with the rules to hold back the tide. Or we can grow up and own up to the fact that this government not only failed to see Brexit winning, but took an active part in the project of fear that sought to scare the British electorate into remaining. Of equal significance, we could realise that this government utterly failed to realise the importance of the electorate and the vote, except insofar as they were willing to look at a yes vote and talk about the people, I'm sure, have spoken. But a vote to leave was, would be and is interpreted as a vote based on greed, narrow self-interest, nationalism of the worst kind and dangerous anti-immigration views. In fact, so busy were members of this government canvassing for a yes vote that little thought was put into the preparation of a plan and a contingency plan, although I welcome that that's now in place. Since the vote, we've had many commentators, journalists and ex-journalists describe the vote in doomsday terms. We have Cliff Taylor telling us that overwhelming opinion of analysis is that the balance for the Irish economy will be negative. The only question is how much. Fintan O'Toole has told us that the electorate, recklessly and casually, with barely a thought, the English nationalists, he said, have planted a bomb under the agreement that brought peace to Northern Ireland and so on. Pat Leahy has told us that the nightmare has actually happened. Pat Cox, former President of the Parliament, talked of mines going off. This is the language of the Remain campaign, of mines going off, that hidden mines that people will walk on and they will explode and people will be not expecting them. Micheál Martin described it as bad for Britain, bad for Ireland and bad for the world. John Bruton utterly failed to recognise the significance of it and of the crisis that Brexit would lead to for the EU. Many of these same people and others repeatedly pointed out in programmes and interviews that the Brexit plan had no plan of action, which was a fair comment and a fair question. But nobody put the question as to what contingency plan those favouring a Remain had, including our own government. And so before and after the vote, we continue to see only one right way to vote and one right way to behave. It does not occur to the commentators, this government, nor the UK government, and most importantly the EU itself, that despite the project of fair and total manipulation of same to force a desired result, the electorate was not fooled. And the only foolish people in reality are those of us who are still unable to digest and learn from the fact that 17 million people voted Brexit, notwithstanding the constant bombardment from the establishment to Remain. And that should alert us, and red bells should ring, that something is seriously amiss with the EU itself. All the more amiss, Cahirley, as significantly the Lisbon Treaty, which I have here and which I've read in Article 50, specifically provides that any country can leave the EU. And indeed, the same article at subparagraph 5 does not preclude the same country from applying to rejoin, but only that its request shall be subject to the proceedings in a different article. And so clearly, as the Lisbon Treaty provides for an orderly and a managed exit of any country from the EU, the question has to be put, given the doomsday scenario but prior to and subsequent to Brexit, why was this article put in the treaty at all in the first place if it wasn't contemplated that a country might exit? And indeed, it begs the question as to whether other articles in the Lisbon Treaty are similarly there as token gestures to be implemented or not, depending on the needs of the markets. Let's take the article in relation to democracy and participation. Article 10.3 of the Lisbon Treaty, a wonderful article. Every citizen shall have the right to participate in the democratic life of the Union, and decisions shall be taken as closely as possible to the citizen. The words and the content of this article and the reality are quite different. We need only look at how we have depleted local government resources and taken away almost all of their powers under the guise of better local government. If we look at Lisbon and Nice that were rerun to get the desire that this government wanted, and if we look at the current negotiations for TIP, under negotiation in complete secrecy. Perhaps therein lies the key to what led to Brexit, the utter disconnect felt on this occasion by the electorate of the United Kingdom, and that we should realise that Brexit is not the problem, but Brexit is the consequence of a problem, and that is the failure of the ruling elite and compliant governments, our own government included, to realise that the democratic deficit is an integral part of the EU. Indeed, as has been pointed out by one or two sensible people, one in particular that drew my attention, Chris Bickerton, said a key theme has been the deep disenchantment voters feel about politics and the contempt that they have for politicians, and there is nothing uniquely British about this. The British referendum is the tip of a much larger iceberg, a European Union of disenchantment. But that commentator and I myself believe it could be the basis for a new internationalism in Europe, one that gives Europe a political meaning far more profound than the shallow cosmopolitanism that comes with the economic integration of the single market. Yes, of course, some of the leaders on the Brexit side carefully and systematically misuse the issue of immigration to support their cause, and I utterly deplore such actions. But to seek to explain Brexit on that basis, however, or to explain it on the basis that 17 million people who voted did not quite understand what they were voting for, is not only contemptuous of the electorate, but it is a seriously dangerous interpretation, which ignores the real reasons for the Brexit vote. And more importantly, such shallow analysis and explanations are not conducive to a proper debate on the significance of Brexit. The EU project, which is more and more led by an elite which is simply unaccountable to the people. It is utterly deaf to what people in different countries, including Ireland, have been saying about the EU, its growing size and power, its overall control, the volume of legislation emanating from there. Eurelex alone indicated that there were 134,000 EU rules, international agreements and legal acts binding and are affecting citizens across the EU alone. The language of its unelected leaders, it has been mentioned already about bombs going off in Dublin. Our treatment of Greece was deplorable, and our connivance in that treatment of Greece was simply appalling. The replacement of legitimate leaders in Italy and Greece and replaced by EU's men really should be ringing alarm bells in our head. In Ireland, we have been subjected to this capricious power on many occasions. Remember, Achahirli, Nice Fuigo, Lisbon Fuigo, the fiscal treaty and the bullying behaviour of the EU institutions and their unelected leaders during the financial crisis. A crisis that was as much created by those same institutions, either by their direct actions or policies and/or their failure to act. And yet, the result for us was the imposition of austerity measures that hit the most vulnerable the hardest, burdened us with debts that we did not incur, while the banks were enabled with our money to strengthen themselves again so as to trade without debt on the free market. If the financial crisis laid bare the EU project for what it was and has become, and how little the nicely worded articles to do with equality and solidarity really matter, then Brexit has removed the remaining fig leaf. Witness the meeting of the leaders of the original six, meeting in secret and issuing instructions, or listen to the President Jean-Claude Juncker, some president, it will not be an amicable divorce, or listen to the European Council President, and as he's moving to reassure the EU that nothing will change, but really, if Britain are going, they should get out. And this is topped by the German MEP who heads the European Parliament's largest political group, and he calls leave means leave, get out. Or better still, look at the barely contained anger in the faces of Europe's elite leaders as the vote of a people who dared to vote differently was published. There's little enough cause for hope with any of the above comments, little sign that they have listened or learned. It is clear that dissent will not be tolerated, and what's happening here is that a message is going out to other countries: dare not to leave. In this country, the failure of repeated governments to learn from the electorate what they said in Nice 1 and Lisbon 2. Indeed, I should rephrase it and say the government's ability to learn from Nice 1 and Nice 2 and to circumvent the express will of the people should be of concern to all Democrats. To change the result from Nice 1, they actually pushed through legislation in one day which prevented the Commission giving out information on both sides. That's how terrified they were of the truth. There will be the most serious consequences for us as a country if we continue along the path of groupthink and if we continue not to question the dogmas. We have been here before. We have seen the dogmatism of the Catholic Church at its most powerful in this country, when bishops reigned supreme and no questions were allowed. Have we thrown off one form of subjugation only to take up another? The market has determined by those who have the power as the supreme power to whom we must serve. Brexit should, if we have any sense, lead us to have the courage to question what the EU is and where it is taking us. We should not allow the extreme right to narrate the story, nor the interpretation of Brexit, nor indeed should we allow the right to describe or produce the type of Europe and society that we want. Perhaps we could begin to listen to people who are outside of the groupthink, somebody like Wolfgang Munchau, who's totally for the European project and yet has the courage to say the case for Remain in the UK boiled down to an intellectually dishonest claim that Britain would be worse off economically or otherwise. It was backed by the near consensual agreement of macroeconomists who, despite the many insights they have to offer, were guilty of overreach. And he goes on, the fear-based Remain campaign was the pinnacle of the profession's intellectual arrogance. The Taoiseach has confirmed that his main aim will be to protect the Irish position, which is likely to mean him aligning himself with the new Prime Minister on certain issues. And that is to be praised and that is to be welcomed. And indeed, I have to say, the Taoiseach's voice was one of moderation, but that only can be judged amongst the rabid voices of the EU. But he also has another role, which is to question on our behalf the undemocratic nature of the EU and to initiate a debate on whether a social Europe that we all desire is at all possible, given the fact that treaty after treaty, and in particular the Lisbon Treaty here, has copper-fastened the neoliberal agenda. The treaty that has committed us to further militarisation of Europe. Taoiseach, I'll conclude by saying I'm delighted that finally the Taoiseach and the Government has published a statement and a task force hopefully will be set up in relation to this. He has mentioned the IDA and he has mentioned other organisations. I would ask him to look at Údarás na Gaeltachta, which has a number of client companies with a lot of exports going to Britain. And finally, I would appeal that we would listen and learn. This is a crisis point, not for England. England will survive this. This is a crisis point for democracy.